like to thank all of you for coming. We know sometimes on a working day during the week it's hard for some people to get away to come and participate in the activities of the day. But I was asked to talk a little bit about the Victrola, so I'll give it my best shot. I personally have two machines myself. One is actually, it came from my brother-in-law's home residence in Boston, and it's a real Edison tall upright one. It's one of the earliest ones. And then I have one similar to this, but a little bit larger. So we all know that Thomas Edison was the inventor of the phonograph. And does anybody know Thomas Edison's middle name by any chance?
Alva.
Yeah, how can you forget a name like that? That's really neat that so many of you knew that. And I remembered it because I went to college at Northwestern in Alva, Oklahoma. So I always had that connection to remember his name. So in 1877, Thomas Edison invented something. He actually invented a lot of things, as we know, thousands of things. But he invented two things that were really important to music people. One would be what? What's he most famous for? The telephone. No, it's the light. The light, electricity, light. And so that was something he spent all of his time and energy on. However, his first invention was actually the phonograph. Okay, and he called it the phonograph, and it was a device that he was leery of when he created the idea of recording sound, because before then you could not replicate sound. Okay, and so he was leery of it because very rarely does your first invention prove to be lasting, and he was concerned that I can't get it right the first time, and he did. And it was really neat. And so he came up with this machine, a steel tube, and he came up with these cylinders. They were made out of wax with other components, but basically wax. And you would slide them on. And then he had this arm that had a little sharp needle attached to it. And then he also had this other little device that came off of it that had a little device here that you would speak into, made out of ceramic material, which was very delicate and like a little wafer. And when he spoke into it, because sound has waves that we can't see, unless you have an oscilloscope, which visually lets you see your sound wave. So he would speak into this, and the vibration would travel through an arm, through the end, which was the needle, that he would drop onto that wax cylinder and just floated on there. And it was heavy enough that it would create a groove, and the vibration of what he was saying would be transferred onto the walls of those grooves on the cylinder. So that was an incredible thing to come up with, an idea, and it worked. Now I need to ask you, does anybody here know what his first words were when he did that? What did he actually say? I mean, when you try something, experiment for the first time, what are you going to say?
Hello.
Maybe your name.
Wow. Nursery rhyme or something?
It was, Steve, thank you.
I don't remember.
It was actually a nursery rhyme. It was Mary had a little lamb. Her fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, her lamb was sure to go. And that's what he said. And then he played it back, and he heard himself, and it was just incredible. Now, in those earliest recordings, you could play that back, and it was actually done, the cylinder, initially, before the wax, when he was experimenting with it, it was made with a kind of aluminum foil around there. And you could play it back a couple of times, and then it would disintegrate, and you couldn't make it out anymore. So he came up with the cylinder. And he came up with this, his first invention, in 1877, but because he was working so hard on his favorite project, which was the electric light bulb, that he left it there for 10 years after it worked, okay? And it wasn't until '87 that he actually took his invention and he would tour the country, okay? And he was trying to share this, saying this is really an awesome thing, and I want to reproduce this in large numbers so that households could share in the joy of hearing sounds or music. And he actually went to the White House. President Rutherford Hayes, he presented it to him as well. So it was a great invention. But after he did that, 10 years following that, there was a gentleman, his name is Emil Berliner, and he was a German immigrant living in Washington, D.C., and he came up with a takeoff on that. You know, when we invent something, there are always people there that take that another step further. And he said, I think I could get a better recording if I do this on like a pancake, a flat surface. And so he improved on that, and then Edison followed up on his improvements, and so the thing kept growing until we have what we know today as records. Initially, when Berliner had his records, they were actually done with a piece of glass. The whole thing was glass, and they grooved in there. And then following that, it moved to zinc, a soft metal. Okay, that's in the lead family. And then following that, they went into a hard rubber and plastic, as we know today, in the records that are still around. We know we can still play them, and actually vinyl recordings, that's the final product, is made out of vinyl and acetate. Those products are now being reproduced from scratch because people love the quality of vinyl recordings. So taking this just a little bit further with the discs, because we don't have any cylinders to share with you here, but the original ones like this one here, this was made in 1906. So this is about 6 years into creating this thing. Initially, it was all only on one side. And so I found in my collection an example of that, and you can see the back side is blank. Okay, and it has a little disclaimer on here that I'm still able to read, and it has to do with copyright. And even back then, they were concerned about taking this product that you purchased, and when you buy it, you have to agree, I promise and swear that I will not reproduce this and share it with my friends. They can come listen to it at my house, but I can't give them a copy of it without paying the inventor. So I thought that was kind of clever that they would stick this little label actually on the recording. And then following that, let's see, Mr. Edison went to these discs that, well, and you can see how thick, this is like a 1/4 inch thick for stability, but they're very brittle, okay? And if you drop it or bang something against it, it will chip away or just break in half and it's done. But I can pass this around. I know normally we don't like to put our hands because we have oils in our hands, but you go ahead and just hold it in the middle and the outside. It won't hurt this. You can see how... No. I want to share with you. I want you to look at it. Look at the center, and it actually has a picture of Mr. Edison.
Oh yes, I see that.
And just think at the time period when this was created, how clever they were, how they could mass produce an image onto a piece of plastic like that and all the information on the album. And then they would do that for so long. Come on in, girls. After that, he said, you can't see the information on my face well enough. So then they decided, why don't we just put labels on it? And so then we come to this disc.
Oh, I can stay.
Okay. So, having shared those items then with you, just to talk for a moment about this particular machine here, This is called a Victrola, which was named after a man, Mr. Victor. And there were several people that got into this industry. They saw the potential of profit, and so many people would follow through with the idea of the phonograph. And the basic way that this functions is the same as the original cylinder. It has an arm. You notice it's a big hollow tube, and it turns here, and there's a needle attached, a steel needle, which normally they say you should use it one time, and you play this record, and then you should take the needle and throw it away. And so you would purchase, and they come in bags of about 100, a little tiny package, and you just use it once and throw it away. It's hard to find them, so when I do play mine for fun at home, I will play maybe 10, a dozen times before I discard it. Okay, the main thing is you don't want it because it wears down the needle, the sharpness of it, and then it gets duller and it goes and it breaks down the walls. Remember, the sound is imprinted on the walls of the grooves. How many of you remember playing records and you hear like all kinds of scratchy noises? Yeah. Now, it's not the scratch like you accidentally run something across the grooves. Okay, that's different. But the actual popping sounds that you hear is dust and fine particles of things in the air that settle on your record, and they're impeding the needle going through what was recorded on it. Okay, and so you would have to take something like this disc here and rub around your recording. Okay, something else to throw in while I happen to think of it. You know, these records, the premise was always to go on the outside edge, and as it played, it went to the center when it was finished, right? And then you took it off. When they came up with the CDs, which didn't come out to the public until 1982, and that came from Japan. They had the first ones. And when they make CDs, they start on the inside and play to the out. Totally opposite of what a record is. I always thought that was fascinating. So we have the machine and the arm, and this is hollow. And so when you start it on the track, then the vibrations go through this, and there are two door fronts here. This side over here, as you can see, is where you would store your record collection. Okay, and you can see it's got a good collection in here. As a matter of fact, Laura said that they have over 1,000 records that have been donated to the Ida Long Goodman Library. So that's where you would store your recordings, and this side is your volume control. So that if you want music in the background while you're doing things, you would play just like this. Okay? But if you want to hear it a little further away, you would just open this up. Okay? And it's not shelves for things. This is the sound to come through. Because the premise of this is still, it's like a megaphone. When you always see the cheerleaders at the crowd, they hold that megaphone, the voice goes through there, and that's the same thing that happens here. That sound then goes through this hollow tube, this arm, and is just nothing more than a megaphone down here. And so if you want to muffle it, just close the door. So that was the only volume. It's either on or it's off, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, I will say this machine used to work pretty good, but as in anything that's older, things start to happen, as we age, as we know. And so this needs to see the Victrola doctor. Okay, and there are very few of those around. Okay, but to get it back to where it needs, it has a little device here, a knob on the corner, that once you start the machine, it's supposed to spin to get a true sound reproduction of the person, for example. It must spin at 80 revolutions per minute. That's the RPM. Okay. This thing starts out below that and goes way past that in a hurry. And so it sounds like Mickey Mouse instead of a person. Now, if you don't mind, I'll just turn it on just so they can hear it on if they haven't before, and then we'll play a real recording. Okay, and so you would crank this. There's a spring inside, and so that would get the momentum going for it to unwind and spin. Okay. Let's and we can't control that. Okay, and all it's doing is unwinding the spring inside. Okay, and this little device in the corner, you put some tension on it to control the speed of that unwinding. And right now it's just unwinding. Okay. There we go. All right. So you can see that's the function of how it works. Now, Laura has graciously done some work here, and we're going to listen through via a Bluetooth speaker, the recording. Sounds like it's coming from the machine, doesn't it? Those are drums, right? Anybody recognize that melody? American Patrol. Okay, John Philip Sousa. Recognize that as a military band. Okay, so it's pretty accurate. You can imagine the amazement of people who have never been able to do anything but hear at one time, either a live performance or talking to someone, and they never would have guessed that you could hear it again and again, the very identical same thing repeated. And so this was an incredible invention for that. Okay. Yeah, of course we know that one too.
That's Dixie.
And Dixie. All right, so that's kind of interesting. Now, just another item or two to think about these discs. They had to standardize things. Okay, because there were many different people trying to get in on that once they were able to have access to the patent of the invention, because you have so much time and then other people can use that information and maybe improve it and call it with their name. Okay, so they had to try to standardize things. Records weren't always this size. Okay, this is called, it normally would have been called an 80. Now, that sounds silly to us. Oh yeah, I have a collection of 80s. Well, we think of the decade, the 80s, okay? But because it's called by the speed at which it has to turn per minute. Okay, that's 80 RPM. Well, if you're old enough to remember the records this size, we used to call them what?
78.
78s. Why?
78
Because it went 78 that's right, per minute. Okay, and it sounds normal to hear someone say, "Oh yeah, I've got some 78s." But all that is talking about those revolutions. But it sounds silly if you say, "Yeah, I've got some 80s." You know.
Yeah.
And then they also came up with there was a record that was larger than this. It went at 33. The old 33s, and they were larger. They actually have some records that are still out there, and they're called 16s, and they're even wider, and they're basically for speaking. Now, the faster you turn, okay, the more space on grooves that the sound is taking up. and therefore the quality goes up. The slower it goes, the less it's traveling around to record your voice. And so for singing or instruments, it requires a better quality. Speaking doesn't require that much. So that's what those 16s were. And of course we went from the 80s to 78s. Then we had the 33s. Do you remember what those were also nicknamed?
LPs,
LPs, and that stood for?
long playing.
Long playing. Yeah, I mean, it's so common. They tried to make common sense words out of it all.
There were 45s too that were
And then
small.
from that, they went to what we call a 45, and that actually traveled at 45 revolutions per minute. And 45s, you remember you had to have an adapter for the point
They
here?
had a bigger hole.
They had a bigger hole, absolutely.
Yes.
And by the time they got to that, the 45s, that lasted great for the time period that we grew up, because people liked to buy just a song, and you had the A side and the B side, right? And they didn't have A side, B side in terms of this is the one that's popular and we're going to throw in another song on the other side of the disc. Okay, at the time that all of this was being done by Mr. Edison and those that followed him, they just wanted to be able to give you more product so they could charge you a little bit more. Right? They would charge you about twice as much as they would for a single-sided disc that it started out on. What are we moving to now to show you how in such a short time of history, from the 1870s when this was invented by Mr. Edison to where we are today? I mean, that's not that far away, because we went from the 45, then we went to the Apple,
Well,
they're called iPods, and then you could, of course there were some other things with radio and transistors in between all of that, but for recorded music, they were actually able to put the records on this little device. Now I'll have to share with you that my car that I used to have before I got married and came to Kansas, I had a huge Grand Prix car. It was my father's car, and when he passed away, he wanted me to have that. And being a young person, I wanted to be really hip, and I saw a product that was created, and it was a device that you would mount on the passenger side under the glove box, and it was a record player. And you could hold 10 45 records. And man, it was so cool. Do you remember that? Any of you have one of those besides me? When I sold my car, the reason I was able to sell it was because they wanted that record player.
Yeah,
I bet.
Now did it come that way, or was it later installed?
No, I put it in myself.
Oh, okay,
I
I'm sorry.
purchased it so you could get it that way. But then we went to the iPod, where you could actually have tons of recordings on a little device. And of course, we always liked CDs and iPods because of the amount of things we could listen to and the variety. But now we've moved into a time where we have streaming, it's called, right? And to me it's kind of sad, because I like all the printed material. Just like even back in this day, you know, I mean, I always liked what came with it, the information. Some people don't care about that kind of thing, but I do. And if you know, with our record albums, didn't you always love to read all the stuff that was inside that record album? And you lose all of that when you go to computerized
I loved it
streaming.
when they had the lyrics written on the sleeve of the record.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't know where's it going to go from streaming. What could be the next step? But it's so hard. Yeah,
Well,
a little chip.
Yeah.
Looks like vinyl is starting to make a comeback.
It is making a comeback.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
you do it, I'm glad.
Turntables and vinyl.
Yeah. One of the big stores that we all looked at was called Tower Records. And there was more in the big cities like the East Coast, the West Coast, Chicago. And I've been to many Tower Records. Well, these are huge 10-story buildings that records and CDs all over the place, mostly CDs anymore. and they're out of business.
Yeah.
They're out of
Sad.
business. Last summer, I was lucky enough to go visit my family in Germany and with my daughter Erica, and we went to Munich to visit my cousin, and I said, want a little time to shop a little bit. Is there a place we can see some music store or something? And she said, well, go in that building over there on the corner. I said, on the 5th floor, it's a 5-story building, and you go up the escalator to the 5th floor, and it's just another world for music people. You walk in there, and it's this huge building, and it's all CDs and listening stations and information and videos. But so we had fun looking, and then this big opening, and there was another huge room, and it was all vinyl records. And they are, as you were saying, they are making a comeback. As a matter of fact, some of the recordings of the Beatles music, I don't know if you knew this or not, but they were recording them on vinyl again. And I looked into that article and I read, and right near the bottom it said, yes, and it was being produced in Salina, Kansas.
Oh, wow. Oh, really?
I didn't know about Salina, but I knew they keep coming out with a new vinyl, like the Abbey Road, the 50th anniversary and stuff like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But it's actually done. One of the main places in the world is Salina, Kansas for recording. So that's kind of cool. One of those little things. I'm proud of where I live. You know, we've got this here.
Yeah.
Anyway. Well, I don't want to just ramble on. I want to thank you all for coming and listening to a little bit about the history of these recordings. And it's sad to say that I can remember years ago going to the dump to drop things off, and I would see a pile of those Edison cylinders or these kind of recordings. Even the machines themselves would be taken to the dump because we have a record player. We don't need that old stuff anymore. And you know, you always say, oh, I wish I'd have had enough sense to save some of that, because it is our history, our legacy of people that have come here from all over the world to become an American. And we can pride ourselves on what have we done as an American. Most things came from other places and we brought it here to this country. But we all know that jazz was invented right here in our country. And people love listening to jazz all over the world. We can say, yeah, that's from here, from us. And so, you know, all these things that we have created in the United States, I think we need to keep shouting out, you know, all the great things that happen here in this country. So, amen. Thank you for coming.